October 14, 1943. 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The commanding officer of 3/JG-2, Hauptmann Egon Meyer, had perfected the art of killing flying fortresses, and today's target, 291 B-17 flying fortresses without fighter escort deep into Germany, represented what he called a target-rich environment. "Look at them," he transmitted to his staffel. "Gentlemen, we're about to teach these Americans that bombers cannot defend themselves, no matter how many guns they mount. Flying in their pretty formations, thinking those machine guns will protect them." What Mayer didn't know, what none of the 300 Luftwaffe fighters gathering for the attack could have anticipated, was that they were about to encounter something unprecedented in aerial warfare. Coordinated defensive fire from hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns operated by gunners who had finally learned to fight as a unified weapon system rather than individual shooters. Within the next 25 minutes, the Luftwaffe would lose 38 fighters to bomber defensive fire, more than they had lost to bombers in any single engagement of the war. The Flying Fortress was about to live up to its name in ways that would transform German attack tactics forever and demonstrate that American industrial firepower, properly coordinated, could turn a bomber formation into a flying battleship. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed in the mid-1930s around a revolutionary concept, a bomber that could defend itself without fighter escort. Boeing's engineers mounted multiple machine gun positions covering all approach angles, creating overlapping fields of fire. The theory was elegant. Attacking fighters would have to penetrate walls of defensive fire regardless of their attack angle. The early B-17E model, entering service in 1941, carried 9.50 caliber machine guns in 5 positions: nose, dorsal, ventral, and 2 waist positions. The later B-17F added a 10th gun. By late 1943, the B-17G mounted 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns, more firepower than most fighter aircraft, concentrated in a single bomber. Each gun could fire 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Each .50 caliber round weighed half an ounce and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy was sufficient to penetrate aircraft aluminum at 1,000 yards and tear through engines, fuel tanks, and pilots with equal efficiency. In theory, a B-17 could throw out over 10,000 rounds per minute of defensive fire. German fighter pilots encountering the early B-17 formations over France in 1942 and early 1943 initially respected the defensive armament, but quickly learned to exploit its weaknesses. The individual gunners, no matter how well trained, were isolated operators trying to track fast-moving targets while flying in formation at high altitude. The guns couldn't depress or elevate enough to cover certain angles. Most critically, the gunners weren't coordinating their fire. Each was fighting his own individual battle. Hauptmann Meyer had been one of the first Luftwaffe pilots to systematically study B-17 vulnerabilities. Through careful analysis of gun camera footage and interrogation of shot-down crews, he identified the critical weakness: the head-on attack. The B-17E and F models had limited forward-firing armament, just 2 handheld .50 caliber guns operated by the bombardier and navigator in the nose. Attacking from 12 o'clock high, a fighter could close to lethal range while facing minimal defensive fire. Meyer perfected what became known as the 12 o'clock high attack. Approach from dead ahead and slightly above, close to 200 yards, fire a concentrated burst into the cockpit and nose, then break away under the bomber. Executed properly, the attack killed pilots and bombardiers, set engines afire, and gave defensive gunners only seconds to respond. By mid-1943, this tactic had become standard throughout the Luftwaffe. German pilots developed variations. Some attacked in pairs from slightly offset angles. Others added cannon-armed FW-190s to the attack. Still others used rockets fired from beyond defensive gun range. But the fundamental concept remained: exploit the B-17's weak forward defense with head-on attacks. The results were devastating. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 cost the 8th Air Force 60 B-17 lost and 168 damaged out of 376 dispatched, a 16% loss rate that was unsustainable. German pilots claimed the head-on attack had solved the flying fortress problem. Some Luftwaffe aces openly mocked American defensive tactics, calling the formations practice targets and B-17 gunners men sitting in flying coffins waiting to die. Oberleutnant Walter Count Punski Ossau, a veteran with over 100 victories, captured the prevailing German attitude in a September 1943 interview with a Luftwaffe propaganda unit. The Americans believe mounting more guns makes their bombers invincible. They don't understand that more guns just means more weight, less maneuverability, and more targets for us to shoot. Their gunners are brave but ineffective. They fire wildly, waste ammunition, and rarely hit anything. The .50 caliber is a good weapon, but in the hands of frightened men trying to hit fighters moving at 400 miles per hour, it might as well be a pistol. What German pilots failed to recognize was that American doctrine was evolving rapidly. Every mission generated after-action reports. Every returning crew was debriefed. Gunnery officers analyzed every engagement, studying what worked and what didn't. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had accumulated enough data to fundamentally transform bomber defensive tactics. The key insight came from Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, who later became famous for piloting the Enola Gay. In his role developing bombing tactics, Tibbets studied defensive fire patterns and recognized the core problem. Gunners were fighting as individuals rather than as a coordinated system. Each gunner selected his own targets, fired at his own discretion, and operated independently. This created gaps in coverage that skilled German pilots exploited. Tibbets proposed a revolutionary approach: treat the entire bomber formation as a single weapons platform. Instead of individual gunners engaging individual targets, all gunners in a formation would coordinate fire, creating zones of concentrated firepower that attacking fighters couldn't penetrate. The concept required training gunners to think beyond their own aircraft and coordinate with gunners on adjacent bombers. The implementation began in September 1943 with intensive gunnery schools in England. Gunners were trained in new procedures. Designated aircraft would have zone commanders who coordinated defensive fire across multiple bombers. When fighters attacked, instead of each gunner selecting targets independently, the zone commander would designate priority targets and coordinate massed fire. More critically, gunners were trained in deflection shooting, leading the target to compensate for the fighter's speed and the bomber's forward motion. Previous training emphasized point shooting, which rarely achieved hits against fast-moving targets. The new training used clay pigeon techniques adapted to aerial gunnery, teaching gunners to track targets smoothly and fire ahead of the target's flight path. Technical improvements accompanied tactical changes. The B-17G, entering service in September 1943, added a chin turret below the nose with twin .50 caliber guns remotely operated by the bombardier. This directly addressed the weak forward defense that German head-on attacks exploited. Additionally, the waist gun positions were staggered to reduce interference between gunners, and ammunition loads were increased from 400 to 500 rounds per gun. But the most significant change was psychological. Previous doctrine treated gunners as individual defenders. The new doctrine emphasized that gunners were crew members of a formation-wide weapon system. They were trained to communicate constantly with other gunners, to coordinate fire, and to understand that their individual accuracy mattered less than the collective volume of fire the formation could generate. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a waist gunner with the 91st Bomb Group, described the training evolution. Before September, they taught us to aim carefully, conserve ammunition, and shoot at specific targets. After the new training, they taught us to fire in zones, to coordinate with other gunners, and to put up walls of lead that fighters couldn't fly through. They said our job wasn't to shoot down fighters, it was to make attacking so dangerous that fighters couldn't press their attacks home. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, became the crucible where new American defensive tactics met experienced German attack doctrine. The mission profile was brutal. 291 B-17s would fly 450 miles into Germany without fighter escort, bomb ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and return, a 900-mile round trip through the most heavily defended airspace in the world. German defensive planning was thorough. Fighter controllers assembled over 300 fighters from multiple Geschwaders, positioning them along the bomber route. The plan called for multiple attack waves. First wave would hit as escorts turned back. Subsequent waves would attack during the bomb run when formations were most vulnerable. Final waves would harass the return flight. The Luftwaffe expected to destroy 100 or more bombers. The first attack wave struck near Aachen as the last P-47 escorts turned back. Meyer's Gruppe, attacking from 12 o'clock high in line abreast formation, executed textbook head-on attacks. But something was immediately, terrifyingly different. Instead of scattered return fire from individual gunners, the German pilots encountered concentrated fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. What Meyer experienced was the new zone defense in action. As his fighters approached, the lead bombardier, serving as zone fire coordinator, designated Meyer's formation as the priority target. Every forward-firing gun in the lead combat box, 24 guns from 12 B-17, focused on the attacking fighters. The Germans flew into a cone of fire containing over 300 rounds per second. Meyer's wingman, Lieutenant Hans Ehlers, was hit immediately. A .50 caliber round penetrated his FW-190's cowling, destroyed 3 cylinders of his BMW 801 engine, and sent metal fragments into his cockpit. Another round shattered his canopy. A third severed his rudder cables. His fighter rolled inverted and entered an uncontrolled dive. Ehlers bailed out at 15,000 feet, wounded and shocked. He had flown 247 combat missions without being seriously hit. The B-17 gunners had destroyed his aircraft in less than 5 seconds. 2 other fighters in Meyer's formation took hits during the same attack pass. One, Bf-109, lost its entire engine cowling to a burst that hit the propeller spinner, sending the cowling spinning into the slipstream. The pilot, unable to see forward and with his engine overheating rapidly, was forced to break off and attempt an emergency landing. The second fighter took hits in the wing route that severed fuel lines, causing a fire that forced the pilot to bail out. Meyer himself felt impacts on his aircraft, rounds hitting his wings and fuselage. His FW-190 shuddered with each hit. He instinctively broke off the attack earlier than planned, shocked by the intensity of defensive fire. In 18 months of combat against B-17s, he had never encountered coordinated fire like this. The pattern repeated across the attacking formations. German fighters approaching from various angles encountered concentrated defensive fire that exceeded anything in their experience. Gunners weren't firing individually. They were firing in coordination, creating fields of intersecting fire that made approach corridors lethal. Oberfeldwebel Herbert Rollwage, flying A, attempted a classic rear quarter attack on the low squadron of the lead combat wing. He approached from 7 o'clock low, expecting to face fire from perhaps 3 or 4 tail gunners. Instead, he encountered fire from tail gunners on 6 different B-17s, all tracking him simultaneously. "I was 400 meters out when the tracers started coming," Rollwage later recounted in his combat report. "Not scattered fire from individual aircraft, but streams of tracers from multiple bombers, all converging on my approach path. It was like flying into a garden hose of fire. I saw rounds passing on both sides, above and below. My aircraft was hit at least 5 times before I could fire a shot. One round penetrated my starboard wing, another hit my propeller blade, a third destroyed my radio. I broke off immediately. I never got into effective firing range." The discipline of the American gunners particularly impressed and disturbed German pilots. Previous encounters had featured wild, unaimed fire that, while intimidating, was relatively ineffective. The October 14th mission featured controlled, coordinated fire that suggested professional training and tactical sophistication. German pilots recognized they were facing not frightened men firing desperately, but trained gunners executing coordinated defensive doctrine. The head-on attacks that had been so successful in previous raids achieved limited success over Schweinfurt. The new chin turrets on B-17Gs meant that fighters approaching from 12 o'clock faced 4 forward-firing guns per bomber instead of 2 handheld guns. More significantly, the concentrated fire from multiple bombers meant that even fighters that successfully penetrated to firing range often took damage before they could effectively engage. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland and an experienced bomber destroyer, led JG-26 in repeated attacks on the 1st Bomb Division's formation. His group made 3 separate head-on passes, destroying several B-17s but losing 4 fighters in the process, an exchange rate that was tactically unsustainable. Galland's post-mission report was sobering. The Americans have improved their defensive fire dramatically. Previously, we could close to 200 meters before encountering effective fire. Today, we were taking hits at 600 meters. The gunners are better trained, their fire is coordinated, and most critically, they have added forward-firing turrets that make head-on attacks far more dangerous. We achieved kills, but at costs we cannot sustain. The statistics from October 14th told a stark story. The 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers, a devastating 20% loss rate that would temporarily halt deep penetration raids. But the Luftwaffe's losses to defensive fire alone were unprecedented. 38 fighters destroyed and 20 damaged, exclusively from bomber guns. Additionally, another 28 fighters were lost to mechanical failures, accidents, or other causes, bringing total German losses to 66 aircraft. More significantly, the kill-to-loss ratio had shifted dramatically. In August raids, the Luftwaffe had lost roughly 1 fighter for every 4 bombers destroyed. At Schweinfurt in October, the ratio was nearly 1-to-1 when considering only losses to defensive fire. If the trend continued, attacking B-17 formations would become suicidal for German fighters. The human cost on both sides was staggering. The 60 lost B-17s represented 600 aircrew killed or captured, entire crews who would not return. But the German pilot losses were equally significant, and for Germany, less replaceable. The 38 pilots lost to defensive fire included experienced veterans who couldn't be quickly replaced. German pilot training programs were already strained. Losing pilots to bomber guns at this rate would bleed the Jagdwaffe faster than training could replace them. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. The confidence that had characterized German fighter operations against B-17 evaporated. Post-mission debriefings revealed pilots were shocked by the defensive fire's intensity. Many experienced pilots reported that attacking B-17 formations had become more dangerous than combat against Soviet fighters on the Eastern Front. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, an experienced ace with 22 victories, described his experience attacking the Schweinfurt formation in his combat diary. "I attacked from 12 o'clock high, the approach we have used successfully for months. The defensive fire was unlike anything I have experienced. Tracers seemed to fill the entire space between me and the bombers. I heard and felt impacts on my aircraft before I reached firing range. My canopy was shattered, my engine was hit, my wing was holed. I fired one brief burst and broke away, my aircraft barely controllable. I was hit 7 times in an attack that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. This is not the same enemy we faced in August." The technical analysis conducted by Luftwaffe intelligence after Schweinfurt revealed the extent of American tactical evolution. Examination of damaged German fighters showed that many had been hit by multiple rounds from different angles, confirming that gunners were coordinating fire. The concentration of hits suggested improved deflection shooting. Rounds were striking the forward sections of attacking fighters, indicating gunners were leading targets properly. Most concerning was the kill analysis. Of the 38 fighters destroyed by defensive fire, 31 had been hit in critical areas: engine, cockpit, or fuel tanks. This wasn't lucky shooting, it was trained marksmanship. The Americans had clearly improved their gunners' training, teaching them not just to fire at fighters, but to aim for vulnerable areas. The Luftwaffe's response was to develop new tactics that reduced exposure to defensive fire. The head-on attack, while not abandoned, was modified. Instead of closing to 200 meters before firing, pilots were instructed to open fire at 400 meters and break off at 300 meters. This reduced accuracy but also reduced exposure to defensive fire. rocket attacks from beyond gun range became increasingly common. The Werfer Granati 21 rocket with a 90mm warhead could be fired from 1,000 meters, outside effective machine gun range. While accuracy was poor, the psychological effect on bomber formations was significant, and the tactic allowed fighters to attack without penetrating defensive fire. Some units began specializing in bomber destruction using heavily armed F-Dublitz 190A-8/R2 Sturmböcke, assault fighters with additional armor plate protecting the pilot and engine, armed with 420mm cannon. These aircraft were designed to press attacks to point-blank range, accepting damage to ensure bomber kills. The tactic acknowledged that attacking B-17 formations would result in taking hits. The goal was to survive those hits long enough to destroy the target. But all these tactical adaptations shared a common feature. They acknowledged that American defensive fire had become genuinely dangerous. The mockery had stopped. German pilots no longer dismissed B-17 gunners as ineffective. They recognized that attacking bomber formations had become one of the most dangerous missions in the Luftwaffe, with casualty rates approaching those of ground attack operations on the Eastern Front. The evolution of B-17 defensive tactics continued beyond Schweinfurt. By early 1944, the introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts fundamentally changed the air war dynamic. German fighters attacking bomber formations now faced not only improved defensive fire, but also escort fighters that could accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The combination proved devastating for the Luftwaffe. Attacking bombers required fighters to fly relatively predictable approach courses, making them vulnerable to escort fighters. The concentrated defensive fire from bomber formations damaged attacking fighters, making them easier targets for escorts. The coordination between bombers and escorts created a layered defense that German fighters couldn't penetrate without prohibitive losses. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson, a P-47 pilot who later transitioned to bomber escort duty, described the evolved defensive system. By spring 1944, attacking a bomber formation was suicide for German fighters. The bombers put up walls of .50 caliber fire that damaged or slowed attacking fighters. We escorts then picked off the damaged fighters or bounced the Germans while they were focused on bombers. The Germans couldn't attack effectively without taking losses they couldn't sustain. The ammunition expenditure statistics revealed the intensity of bomber defensive operations. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force's B-17s expended over 2 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition on the Schweinfurt mission alone, an average of nearly 7,000 rounds per bomber. This exceeded ammunition consumption in any previous raid and demonstrated that gunners were no longer conserving ammunition, but instead firing to create zones of protective fire. The industrial capacity that enabled this ammunition expenditure was itself a weapon. American factories produced over 1.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war, enough to support sustained high-volume defensive fire on every mission. German pilots recognized that they faced not just better-trained gunners, but an enemy that could afford to fire without regard to ammunition constraints. The kill claims and actual kills revealed interesting patterns. American gunners claimed 288 fighters destroyed on the October 14th mission, far more than the 38 actually lost to defensive fire. This overclaiming was understandable. Multiple gunners firing at the same fighter would each claim the kill when it went down. But the Luftwaffe's analysis confirmed that at least 38 fighters were destroyed exclusively by defensive fire, with another 20 damaged severely enough to require extensive repairs. More significantly, the ratio of claims to actual kills improved over time as gunners became more experienced. By mid-1944, statistical analysis showed that actual German losses to defensive fire closely matched the number of fighters that multiple B-17 crews independently confirmed as destroyed, typically about 15 to 20% of total claims. This suggested that while overclaiming remained common, the improved training created some gunners capable of genuinely effective fire. The personal accounts from B-17 gunners revealed the psychological transformation that accompanied tactical evolution. Early in the war, gunners described feeling helpless as German fighters attacked. By late 1943, gunners described feeling like active participants in their aircraft's defense, capable of fighting back effectively. Technical Sergeant Michael Aruth, a top turret gunner with the 379 bomb group, described the change. "In my first missions, I felt like a target. The Germans would attack, I'd fire back, and it felt like throwing rocks at wolves. After the new training and the coordination procedures, I felt like I was part of a weapon system. When Germans attacked, I wasn't just one gunner. I was part of a formation putting up hundreds of guns. We learned to work together, to focus fire, to create kill zones. The Germans learned to respect that, or they died." The German perspective on this evolution was captured in numerous post-war interviews. Pilots uniformly described October 1943 as the turning point when bomber defensive fire became genuinely dangerous rather than merely annoying. The combination of improved tactics, better training, additional guns, and coordinated fire transformed the B-17 from a target that could be attacked with reasonable safety into a heavily defended fortress that exacted heavy costs from attackers. General Major provided perhaps the most comprehensive German assessment of American bomber defensive evolution in his post-war memoirs. In 1942 and early 1943, we respected B-17 firepower but didn't fear it. The bombers had many guns, but their gunners were poorly trained and uncoordinated. We developed tactics that exploited their weaknesses, particularly head-on attacks that faced minimal defensive fire. We became confident, perhaps overconfident, that we had solved the bomber problem. Schweinfurt in October 1943 shattered that confidence. The Americans had learned. Their gunners were better trained. Their fire was coordinated. Most critically, they had added forward-firing turrets that made our preferred head-on attacks far more dangerous. Combined with increased fighter escorts, the bomber offensive became sustainable for the Americans and unsustainable for us. We mocked their gunners early in the war. We called them boys playing with guns and joked that .50 caliber fire was merely annoying. But by late 1943, those .50 caliber guns, properly employed by trained gunners firing in coordination, became one of the most effective air-to-air weapon systems in the war. The Americans didn't just improve their gunnery. They transformed their bombers into coordinated weapon platforms that made attacking them prohibitively expensive. The real lesson was about institutional learning and industrial capacity. The Americans analyzed every engagement, identified weaknesses, developed solutions, trained their crews systematically, and applied unlimited resources to implementation. They turned their bombers into fortresses not through better individual gunners, but through systematic coordination, training, and the industrial capacity to fire without regard to ammunition costs. We couldn't match that combination. By 1945, the defensive systems on B-17s represented the culmination of this evolution. The B-17G mounted 13 machine guns with improved sighting systems, coordinated through intercom systems that allowed gunners to communicate constantly. Formations flew with designated fire coordinators who directed defensive fire. Gunners trained extensively in deflection shooting, target identification, and coordinated fire procedures. The result was that attacking a B-17 formation in 1945 required Luftwaffe fighters to penetrate multiple layers of defense. Escort fighters operating at all altitudes, coordinated defensive fire from hundreds of bomber guns, and supporting ground-based radar that could vector additional fighters to threatened formations. The system was layered, redundant, and backed by industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than they occurred. The final statistics of the strategic bombing campaign revealed the effectiveness of evolved defensive tactics. Of approximately 4,750 Luftwaffe fighters, Lost in combat against Western Allied forces in 1944–45, roughly 20% were credited to bomber defensive fire, nearly 1,000 fighters destroyed by the weapon system that German pilots had initially mocked as ineffective. The human cost was measured in German pilots who learned too late that American bomber gunners had evolved from frightened men firing wildly to trained operators of coordinated weapon systems. The Luftwaffe's pilot training system, already strained by losses on multiple fronts, couldn't replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being lost to bomber guns and escort fighters. The transformation from mockery to respect was complete. German pilots who survived the war universally acknowledged that attacking B-17 formations had become the most dangerous mission in the Luftwaffe by 1944. The Flying Fortress had lived up to its name not through invulnerability, but through creating defensive fire so intense, so coordinated, and so sustained that attacking became a calculated risk that most German pilots didn't survive long enough to master. The lead that started flying over Schweinfurt in October 1943 didn't stop. It increased in volume, accuracy, and lethality until the war's end. The 50 caliber machine guns that German pilots had dismissed as ineffective became, in aggregate and properly coordinated, one of the most effective air defense systems of the war. The gunners who had been mocked as boys with guns became trained operators who destroyed nearly 1,000 German fighters and helped ensure that American strategic bombing could continue despite all German efforts to stop it. In the end, German fighter pilots learned what every opponent who underestimated American industrial capacity eventually learned: that the United States didn't just produce more weapons, they systematically improved how those weapons were employed until quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority. The B-17 gunners didn't just get better. They became part of a coordinated defensive system backed by unlimited ammunition and systematic training that transformed bombers into flying fortresses that extracted prohibitive costs from any fighter pilot brave or foolish enough to press an attack home. The mockery stopped the day the lead started flying, and once it started, it never stopped until Germany surrendered and the sky belonged to the fortresses that had fought their way there, one coordinated burst of .50 caliber fire at a time.